Outlaws target Clint Eastwood, not knowing he's a former Green Beret sniper. Before we dive in, kindly hit the subscribe button and let us know where you're watching from in the comments. The oppressive heat of a Texas summer bore down on the small, dilapidated saloon where Roar and his gang convened. Dust motes hung heavy in the stagnant air as the men huddled around a rickety table. The gang's leader, Roar, a man with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue, laid out a yellowed map of the train's route, his calloused fingers tracing the tracks that snaked through the lone valley. The saloon creaked with every shift of weight, as if the building itself shared the tension in the room. "Here," Roar said, stabbing a finger at the map. "This is where we'll stop the train. Narrow gorge, steep cliffs. No way for them to escape. They'll have to stop, and when they do, we hit them hard and fast." His voice carried a conviction that none of the gang dared question. He had led them through dozens of jobs before, and though he was ruthless, he was also cunning. Roar did not tolerate failure, and his men knew better than to challenge him. The gang, 9 men in total, listened intently as Roar detailed the plan. Boone, the sharpshooter, smirked as he leaned back in his chair, spinning a pistol on his finger. "A train full of gold and a couple of guards. Sounds like easy pickings to me," he said, his voice dripping with overconfidence. Kane, the demolitions expert, chuckled as he chewed on the end of an unlit cigar. "I'll blow that bridge sky high," he promised, his grin revealing crooked teeth. The others nodded in agreement, their faces etched with greed and anticipation. Roar slammed his hand on the table, silencing the chatter. "Focus," he growled. "This isn't some 2-bit bank job. We're talking about a shipment worth more than all our previous hauls combined. The government doesn't send gold like this without protection, so don't underestimate the guards." His piercing gaze swept across the room, ensuring his warnings sunk in. "We hit fast, we take what we need, and we vanish before anyone knows what happened." "Understood." The men murmured their assent, their bravado tempered by Roar's warning. They spent the next hour going over the details of the heist. Roar assigned each man a role. Boone would provide cover fire from the cliffs, Kane would handle the explosives, and the rest would storm the train and secure the gold. Their escape route was mapped out to the last detail, with horses stashed a mile from the gorge to ensure a quick getaway. Every aspect of the plan was meticulous, leaving nothing to chance. Or so they believed. What the gang didn't know was that the train wasn't as defenseless as it appeared. In the final car, seated in the shadows with his back against the wall, was Clint Eastwood. He was a man of few words, his stoic demeanor and piercing blue eyes giving little away. The train crew and passengers avoided him, unnerved by the quiet intensity he radiated. Dressed in a simple jacket and hat, Clint looked like any other guard, but his presence carried an unspoken authority. To the untrained eye, Clint seemed like a relic of the past, a man out of place in a changing world. But beneath his calm exterior was a mind honed by years of war and survival. Clint had been a Green Beret sniper, one of the best in the U.S. military, and his skill with a rifle was legendary among those who had served with him. After leaving the military, he sought a quieter life, far from the chaos and bloodshed of his past. The railways offered him solitude, a chance to lose himself in the endless landscapes of the American frontier. But Clint's peace was always fragile. He had learned long ago that danger could strike when least expected, and he was always prepared. As the train departed El Paso, carrying its precious cargo into the vast Texas wilderness, Clint sat in silence, his rifle concealed but within easy reach. He had no idea what awaited him in the Lone Valley, but he didn't need to. Years of instinct and training had taught him to expect the worst and to survive it. As the gang finalized their plan in the saloon, their laughter and bravado echoed into the night. They were confident, perhaps too confident, in their ability to pull off the heist. But the sun would soon rise over the Texas desert, and with it, a reckoning they could never have anticipated. The stage was set, the players in place, the train rolled steadily toward its destination, and fate prepared to intervene in ways none of them could foresee. The rhythmic clatter of steel wheels on iron rails filled the air as the train barreled through the vast Texas desert, leaving a trail of dust and smoke in its wake. The golden hues of the late afternoon sun bathed the rugged landscape, casting long shadows across the sprawling terrain. Inside the train, passengers chatted in hushed tones or gazed out of the windows, unaware of the danger lurking ahead. In the rear car, Clint Eastwood sat alone, his sharp eyes scanning the horizon through the dirty window. Clint had been assigned to guard the gold shipment, a job he initially saw as a routine task. The cargo car, situated directly ahead of him, was fortified with thick iron doors and heavy locks, but Clint knew better than to rely on mere barriers for protection. He had seen what desperate men were capable of, and he had learned never to underestimate human greed. His rifle rested within arm's reach, a silent reminder of his readiness. The train rolled deeper into the wilderness, the landscape shifting from flat desert plains to jagged hills and rocky outcroppings. Clint's gaze was unyielding, scanning every detail of the terrain. He had a soldier's instinct, an almost preternatural ability to sense danger. Something about the upcoming stretch of track, the narrow gorge flanked by steep canyon walls, set his nerves on edge. It was the perfect spot for an ambush. Farther ahead, hidden among the rocks and scrub, Roar's gang was making their final preparations. Their horses tied to sturdy mesquite trees pawed at the ground impatiently. The men crouched low, their faces streaked with dust and grime, their weapons gleaming in the fading sunlight. Boone, the gang's sharpshooter, lay prone on a ledge, his rifle trained on the train's approaching silhouette. "Right on time," he muttered, his lips curling into a smirk. Roar crouched beside him, his keen eyes fixed on the train. He had chosen this location for a reason. The gorge's sharp turns and narrow passage left the train vulnerable, forcing it to slow down as it navigated the curve. The bridge ahead was the linchpin of his plan. Once Kane detonated the explosives, the train would have no choice but to stop, and they could take the gold with ease, or so he thought. "Remember, we move fast," Roar whispered to his men as they gathered in a tight circle. "Boone, you take out anyone who looks like they might be trouble. Kane, blow the bridge once the engine has passed. The rest of you, get that gold loaded and be ready to ride. No mistakes." His voice was low but commanding, and the gang nodded in unison. They had rehearsed this heist in their minds 100 times, and now the moment had come. As the train's whistle echoed across the canyon, the gang fanned out, taking their positions with practiced precision. Kane crouched near the bridge, his satchel of dynamite at the ready. The others lined up along the tracks, weapons drawn, their faces masked with bandanas. From their vantage points, they could see the train's black engine rounding the bend, its plume of smoke cutting through the twilight sky. Back on the train, Clint felt the tension in the air before he saw anything. His body, trained by years of combat, seemed to react on its own. He stood, his hand instinctively resting on the butt of his revolver. The horizon ahead looked deceptively still, but Clint's gut told him otherwise. He moved toward the rear door of his car, opening it just enough to feel the cool desert breeze. His eyes swept the landscape, searching for the faintest sign of movement. Then he saw it. A glint of light on a distant ridge, a scope, perhaps. Clint's jaw tightened. He reached for his rifle, his movements deliberate and unhurried. The train continued its steady march toward the gorge, unaware of the trap that awaited it. Clint crouched low, his body blending with the shadows, and prepared for what he knew was coming. In the canyon ahead, Roar's gang waited like predators, ready to pounce. The tension was palpable, the quiet hum of anticipation broken only by the trains approaching Roar. The Outlaws believed they had every advantage. What they didn't know was that their prey was far from defenseless. Clint Eastwood wasn't just a guard. He was a predator in his own right, and the game was about to begin. The train moved steadily through the Texas wilderness, its steel wheels grinding rhythmically against the rails as the engine let out a long, mournful whistle. The passengers inside had begun to relax, lulled by the monotony of the journey and the golden hues of the setting sun. The cargo car, heavily fortified and secured, carried a fortune in gold, a secret known to only a few aboard. Clint Eastwood sat silently in the rear car, his sharp eyes locked on the narrowing canyon ahead. Every instinct he had honed as a Green Beret was screaming at him. Danger was near. The gorge loomed closer, its towering walls of red rock casting long shadows over the tracks. The train slowed slightly, its whistle cutting through the stillness of the canyon like a warning cry. Clint's fingers tightened around the stock of his rifle as his gaze swept over the cliffs. He had no evidence of an ambush yet, but he could feel it, like the crackling of a storm in the air. The canyon was too quiet, the stillness too unnatural. Something was wrong. Ahead, concealed behind the rocky outcroppings, Roar's gang lay in wait. Kane crouched low near the bridge, carefully placing sticks of dynamite along its supports. The sweat on his brow glistened as he worked quickly, his movements methodical and precise. Boone, the sharpshooter, was positioned on a ridge overlooking the train's path, his rifle resting against his shoulder as he tracked the engine's progress. "Any minute now," he muttered under his breath, his finger resting lightly on the trigger. Roar stood with the rest of the gang, his revolver holstered but ready. His eyes gleamed with determination as he turned to his men. "Remember the plan," he hissed. "Once the train stops, Boone keeps an eye out for any guards. Kane, you hit the trigger. Everyone else, grab the gold and get to the horses. No heroics, no mistakes. We in and out before they even know what hit them." The train reached the bridge, and for a brief moment, everything seemed normal. Then, with a deafening roar, the dynamite exploded, sending a massive plume of smoke and debris into the air. The bridge crumbled into the gorge below, the twisted remains of its supports falling into the rushing river beneath. The train's engineer slammed on the brakes, the wheels screeching in protest as the locomotive ground to a halt just short of the gap. Passengers screamed and clutched at their seats, thrown forward by the sudden stop. Clint felt the train lurch to a halt, and in that instant, he knew his suspicions were correct. Grabbing his rifle, he moved to the rear door of the car, his movements calm and deliberate. Through the smoke and chaos, he caught sight of masked figures emerging from the shadows, their weapons gleaming in the fading light. Roar's gang was swarming the train, shouting orders as they moved toward the cargo car. Clint positioned himself on the roof of the rear car, crouching low to avoid detection. Roar led the charge, his revolver drawn. As he barked commands, "Get that gold loaded! Boone! Cover us!" The gang moved with practiced efficiency, breaking into the cars and forcing passengers to the ground. Women screamed and children cried as the outlaws tore through the compartments, searching for the cargo. From his vantage point on the roof, Clint scanned the scene below. His mind worked quickly, assessing the situation and formulating a plan. He could see Boone on the ridge, his rifle trained on the train. Kane was at the rear, holding what looked like another stick of dynamite, ready to deal with any resistance. The rest of the gang was clustered near the cargo car, working to break the locks and gain access to the gold. Clint took a deep breath and steadied his rifle. He wasn't the type to wait for trouble to come to him. His first target was Boone, the sharpshooter. Boone posed the greatest threat to Clint's position. With the precision of a man who had spent years behind enemy lines, Clint squeezed the trigger. The shot rang out, cutting through the chaos. Boone fell from his perch, his rifle clattering against the rocks as he tumbled lifelessly to the ground. The sound of the gunshot sent a wave of panic through the gang. Roar spun around, his eyes scanning the cliffs. "Who the hell fired that?" he shouted, his voice laced with anger and confusion. The gang froze, their confidence shaken as they realized they were under attack. Clint moved silently across the roof, his every step calculated. He wasn't just defending the train, he was hunting. From the cliffs to the tracks below, the ambush had turned into chaos. Roar's meticulously planned heist was unraveling, and the gang was beginning to realize that their target wasn't as defenseless as they had thought. Clint Eastwood, the silent sentinel, had turned the tables, and the outlaws were now prey in his sights. The canyon echoed with Boone's dying gasp as his body crumpled to the ground, his rifle skidding across the rocks. High above the chaos, Clint Eastwood adjusted his position, his sharp eyes narrowing as he scanned the panicked outlaws below. He didn't revel in the kill, but he knew it was necessary. Boone had been the most immediate threat, and now he was out of the equation. Clint's calm, deliberate movements betrayed none of the adrenaline coursing through his veins. Years of training had taught him to stay focused even under fire. On the ground, the gang scattered like startled jackrabbits, their confidence eroding as they realized they were being hunted. "What the hell just happened?" Kane shouted, clutching his dynamite with trembling hands. Roar spun toward where Boone had been stationed, his face a mask of disbelief. "Boone's down!" one of the gang members yelled, his voice cracking with fear. Roar's eyes blazed as he barked out orders. "Stay sharp! He's got to be on the train!" But even Roar's commanding tone couldn't fully mask the unease creeping into his voice. This was supposed to be a simple job. Get in, grab the gold, and get out. Now, they were facing an unseen enemy who was systematically picking them apart. Clint, meanwhile, moved with the precision of a ghost. He knew he couldn't stay in one spot for long. The element of surprise was his greatest weapon, and he intended to use it to full effect. Silently, he climbed down from the roof of the rear car and slipped into the shadows, his rifle cradled in his arms. Every step was calculated, every breath controlled. His eyes darted to the gang as they regrouped near the cargo car, their movements hurried and disorganized. Roar, trying to regain control of the situation, motioned for Kane to set up his explosive device near the locked cargo doors. "Blow it open," he ordered. Kane nodded, his hands fumbling as he set the charges. The others formed a loose perimeter, their guns raised and their eyes darting nervously across the terrain. They knew they were exposed, but they couldn't see where the threat was coming from. The air was thick with tension, the oppressive silence broken only by the distant cries of frightened passengers and the occasional shout from one of the outlaws. Clint watched from the shadows, his mind working quickly. He had already taken out Boone, but Kane was the next priority. The demolitions expert posed a significant risk not just to the gold, but to the entire train. Clint adjusted the scope on his rifle, his sights locking onto Kane's hunched form. He took a deep breath, steadying his aim. As he lined up the shot, the crack of the rifle echoed through the canyon, and Kane's body jerked violently before collapsing to the ground. The dynamite rolled from his limp fingers, landing harmlessly on the dirt. Another outlaw down. Clint didn't waste time watching the aftermath. He moved again, slipping further down the length of the train, his movements fluid and purposeful. The gang erupted into chaos. "Kane's gone!" one of them shouted, his voice tinged with panic. Roar's face twisted in fury as he grabbed the nearest outlaw by the collar. "Pull yourself together," he snarled. "He's just one man. Find him." But even Roar couldn't ignore the growing dread in his gut. Whoever was out there wasn't just lucky. He was skilled, dangerous, deadly. The remaining outlaws began to spread out, their nerves fraying with each passing second. They searched the train and the surrounding terrain, their fingers tightening on the triggers of their guns. Clint watched their movements, calculating his next move. He wasn't in a hurry. Fear was a weapon, and he wielded it masterfully. Every shadow, every rustle of the wind became a source of terror for the gang. Roar, now flanked by his two closest men, gritted his teeth as he scanned the train. "He's picking us off one by one," he muttered under his breath. "Stay close. He can't take us all if we stick together." But even as he spoke, he knew it was a fragile reassurance. The hunter they were up against wasn't just skilled. He was relentless. Clint crouched behind a stack of barrels near the rear of the train, listening to the outlaws' frantic shouts. He could hear the fear in their voices, the way their bravado had crumbled into desperation. He allowed himself a brief moment to assess his own situation. 2 down, 7 to go. He would need to conserve his ammunition and rely on his surroundings to maintain the upper hand. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the canyon into shadow, Clint moved once again. The hunt was far from over, but he was patient. He didn't need to rush. The outlaws had come here expecting an easy score, but they had found a nightmare instead. Clint Eastwood wasn't just protecting the gold. He was turning their heist into a battle for survival, and the night was only just beginning. The last light of day faded into the horizon, leaving the canyon cloaked in a heavy darkness. The outlaws, once bold and brimming with confidence, were now fragmented, their nerves frayed as Clint Eastwood continued to stalk them like a shadowy predator. The train stood still, a dark, hulking mass amidst the jagged cliffs, its passengers silenced by fear. Smoke from the dynamite explosion lingered in the air, mingling with the rising tension. For the first time, the gang realized they weren't hunting, they were being hunted. Roar paced behind an overturned train car, his revolver drawn and his eyes scanning the darkness. The deaths of Boone and Kane weighed heavily on him, though he dared not show it. The remaining 7 outlaws crouched nearby, whispering among themselves, their fear palpable. Sanchez, the gang's knife expert, spoke first, his voice low but trembling. "He's taking us out one by one." Boone didn't even see it coming. "This isn't some ordinary guard, Roar." "Enough!" Roar snapped, his voice cutting through the whispers. "He's just a man with a gun. He bleeds like anyone else." But even as he spoke, his words rang hollow. Whoever this guard was, he wasn't just some hired hand. His precise shots, his ability to disappear into the shadows, it was unlike anything Roar had encountered. Still, he refused to let fear take hold. The gold was so close, and Roar wasn't about to leave empty-handed. Meanwhile, Clint moved through the shadows like a wraith. His footsteps were silent, his every move calculated. He had switched from his rifle to his sidearm, a sleek revolver he carried for close combat. Clint knew he couldn't rely solely on distance. The gang was beginning to spread out, their paranoia forcing them to cover more ground. He planned to use that to his advantage. Perched on a ridge overlooking the train, Clint crouched low, watching the outlaws' movements below. He could see Roar barking orders, trying to maintain control of his increasingly desperate men. Clint's sharp eyes caught the glint of a rifle barrel as one of the outlaws, a lanky man named Red, crept toward the rear car. Red's steps were hesitant, his head swiveling nervously as he tried to peer into the darkness. Clint smirked grimly. Fear was his greatest ally, and he was about to exploit it. Clint shifted his position, kicking a small rock down the side of the ridge. The sound echoed through the canyon, drawing Red's attention. The outlaw froze, his rifle trembling in his hands. "Who's there?" Red called out, his voice cracking. He took a step forward, his eyes darting wildly in the dark. Clint waited, his breathing steady, his revolver poised. When Red was close enough, Clint struck like lightning. A single shot rang out, shattering the stillness. Red fell to the ground, clutching his chest as his rifle clattered beside him. The other outlaws spun toward the sound, their guns raised, but Clint was already gone, melting back into the shadows. Panic rippled through the gang like wildfire. They huddled closer together, their early bravado now replaced by a growing sense of dread. "Damn it!" Roar growled, slamming his fist against the overturned car. "He's picking us off like flies." Sanchez leaned against the car, his face pale. "This isn't just a guard, Roar. He's trained military, maybe. No way he's doing this by luck." The gang leader shot him a glare, but he didn't argue. Deep down, Roar knew Sanchez was right. This wasn't the work of an amateur. It was the work of a professional. Clint moved silently through the AG, his eyes scanning for his next target. He spotted two of the outlaws standing near the cargo car, their backs to him as they argued in hushed tones. He approached slowly, his revolver steady in his hand. One of the men, a burly figure named Briggs, turned just as Clint reached them. Briggs barely had time to raise his weapon before Clint fired. The shot echoed through the canyon. The second man tried to run, but Clint was faster. Another shot, another body hit the ground. The remaining outlaws scrambled, their nerves unraveling with each passing moment. Roar grabbed Sanchez by the arm, his voice low and urgent. "We need to regroup, get to the horses, and fall back to the cliffs. He's got the advantage here, but he can't pick us all off if we stick together." Sanchez nodded reluctantly, his hand tightening around the hilt of his knife. As the gang retreated toward the cliffs, Clint watched from the shadows. He could see the cracks forming in their unity, the fear that clouded their judgment. He had fought men like them before, men who thought numbers and brute force were enough to guarantee success. But Clint wasn't just any opponent. He was patient, methodical, and unrelenting. The canyon fell silent once more, save for the distant cries of the passengers and the faint rustle of the wind. Clint adjusted his hat and reloaded his revolver, his movements calm and deliberate. The hunt wasn't over yet, but the wolves had become prey, and Clint had no intention of letting them escape. The canyon had grown colder with the fall of night, but the air was thick with the sweat of fear and desperation. The once mighty gang of outlaws, led by the infamous Roar, was now reduced to a scattered, disorganized group of survivors. For men were already dead, each taken out with the kind of precision that left the rest questioning whether they were dealing with a man or something far more sinister. The gold that had seemed so tantalizingly close just hours ago now felt like a distant dream, overshadowed by the grim reality of survival. Roar crouched behind an overturned train car with Sanchez and three others, Harlan, Vic, and Carter. Their faces were etched with exhaustion, their nerves frayed from the relentless pressure of being hunted. Roar tightened his grip on his revolver, his knuckles white as he tried to think of a way out. His plan had been flawless, but none of them had anticipated this one man. A single guard had turned their perfect heist into a nightmare. "We're sitting ducks out here," Sanchez muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. He clutched the hilt of his knife, his fingers twitching. "He's picking us off like it's a damn game." "Shut up," Roar snapped, his eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. "Panicking isn't going to help us. He's just one man, he's not invincible. But he might as well be." Harlan interjected, his voice trembling. Boone and Kane didn't even see him coming. Red didn't stand a chance, and Briggs. He stopped, shaking his head as the memory of their comrade's death sighed heavy on him. Roar shot Harlan a glare. Enough! We're not gonna fall apart now. We stick together, keep our eyes sharp, and move as one. He can't take all of us if we're smart. Smart, Vic said, his tone dripping with bitterness. You call us smart? You dragged us into this mess. This was supposed to be easy. Grab the gold and ride off into the sunset. Now we're being hunted like animals. Roar slammed the butt of his revolver against the train car, silencing Vic's complaints. You think I don't know that? You think I don't feel the weight of this? But we're not done yet. You want to run? Fine, go ahead. But if you do, you're as good as dead. He pointed toward the dark cliffs. The only way out of this is through him. So either you fight or you die, your choice. The gang fell into a tense silence, each man weighed down by the gravity of their situation. Carter, the youngest and least experienced of the group, swallowed hard and tightened his grip on his shotgun. He looked to Roar for guidance, his wide eyes betraying his fear. What do we do now? He asked, his voice shaking. Roar's jaw clenched as he considered their options. He had always been a man who thrived under pressure, but this was different. This wasn't just a matter of strategy. It was a matter of survival. He glanced at Sanchez, who was sharpening his knife with a wet stone, his hands steady despite the tension. We head for the cliffs, Roar said finally, his voice low but resolute. If we can get to higher ground, we might have a chance to turn the tables on him. He's been using the shadows to his advantage, but up there we'll have a better line of sight. And what about the gold? Carter asked hesitantly. Roar's eyes hardened. Forget the gold. It's not worth dying for right now. All that matters is getting out of here alive. As the gang began to move, Clint watched from his perch high above them. He had been tracking their movements since the sun had set, his keen eyes never losing sight of his prey. He could see the fear in their every step, the way they huddled together like frightened animals. They were breaking, their confidence shattered, and Clint knew it was only a matter of time before they fell completely. He adjusted his position, his rifle steady in his hands. He didn't fire yet. Clint was patient, methodical. He wanted them to feel the weight of their mistakes, to know that their every move was being watched. Fear was a weapon, and Clint wielded it with the precision of a master. The gang moved cautiously toward the cliffs, their footsteps crunching against the gravel-strewn ground. Sanchez took point, his knife glinting in the moonlight as he scanned the path ahead. Roar stayed close behind, his revolver drawn, his eyes darting from shadow to shadow. Carter lagged slightly, his shotgun shaking in his hands. He glanced over his shoulder, half expecting Clint to emerge from the darkness at any moment. They reached the base of the cliffs and began to climb, their breathing labored from the effort. Clint followed silently, his movements as fluid as the wind. He had no intention of letting them escape. Not yet. He wanted them to reach the top, to think they had gained the upper hand before he struck again. As they climbed higher, Roar's confidence began to return. He could feel the cool night breeze on his face, could see the canyon stretching out below him. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to believe that they might actually survive this. But Clint Eastwood was a man who thrived on turning hope into despair, and Roar was about to learn that the hard way. The cliffs loomed high above the canyon, jagged and unforgiving. Roar and the remnants of his gang scrambled up the rocky terrain, their movements frantic yet determined. The moon cast an eerie glow over the scene, illuminating their climb as shadows danced along the cliff face. Each man's breath came in short, sharp gasps. the strain of the ascent compounded by the unrelenting fear of the predator stalking them from the shadows. The stillness of the night was broken only by the sound of their boots crunching against loose rocks. Sanchez led the way, his knife drawn, the blade reflecting the pale moonlight. His normally steady hands were now trembling as he scanned the area ahead. Every rustle of wind, every shifting shadow felt like a harbinger of death. Behind him, Roar climbed with a grim determination, his revolver gripped tightly in his hand. He refused to let his fear show, though it clawed at his insides with every passing moment. Further back, Carter struggled to keep up, his shotgun slung over his shoulder. The youngest of the group, he was barely holding it together. His mind raced with the images of his fallen comrades. Boone's lifeless body on the ridge, Kane crumpled near the dynamite, Briggs lying motionless on the dirt. Each death played over and over in his mind, a grim reminder of the fate that could await him. "We're not going to make it," he whispered, his voice trembling as he glanced over his shoulder. "He's out there watching us." "Shut up, Carter," Roar snapped, his voice low but laced with authority. "Keep climbing. He's not invincible, and he sure as hell isn't a ghost. We'll deal with him when the time comes." But even as Roar spoke, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that the man hunting them was more than just human. Clint Eastwood was unlike any foe he had faced before, a relentless, calculating force of nature. Unbeknownst to the gang, Clint was already on their trail. He moved silently, his steps deliberate and precise, as if he were one with the shadows. His years of military training as a Green Beret sniper had honed his instincts to a razor's edge, and he used those skills now to stalk his prey. He could see their movements clearly, the moonlight betraying their every step. Clint knew the terrain well. He had walked these cliffs before, during his quieter days on the railways. Every rock, every crevice was an advantage he could exploit. From his vantage point further down the cliff, Clint could hear the outlaws' labored breathing, their boots scuffing against the rocks. He watched as Sanchez reached the top of the ridge, pulling himself onto flat ground. Roar followed close behind, then Vic and Carter. Clint's lips curled into a grim smile. "Let them think they've gained the upper hand," he thought. "It'll make it all the more devastating when I take it away." At the top of the cliff, the gang regrouped, their breaths coming in heavy pants. The flat expanse stretched out before them, offering a panoramic view of the canyon below. For a brief moment, they felt a flicker of hope. Up here, they had the high ground. Up here, they could see their enemy coming. "This is where we make our stand," Roar declared, his voice steady despite the knot of fear in his stomach. He pointed to a cluster of rocks that provided some cover. "We dig in here. Sanchez, take the left flank. Carter, you watch the rear. Vic, stay with me." The men nodded, their faces pale but resolute. They weren't just fighting for the gold anymore. They were fighting for their lives. As they positioned themselves behind the rocks, Sanchez muttered under his breath, "I swear, he's not human. No one can move like that, shoot like that. It's like he knows our every move." Roar shot him a glare, but he didn't argue. Deep down, Roar knew Sanchez was right. This wasn't the work of an amateur. It was the work of a professional. The silence of the canyon was oppressive, the darkness closing in around them like a predator circling its prey. Hours passed, or perhaps only minutes. It was impossible to tell. The stillness gnawed at their nerves, every creak of the rocks, every whisper of wind sending their hands to their weapons. And then, it began. A single shot rang out, shattering the stillness like a thunderclap. Carter, positioned near the rear, let out a strangled cry and fell to the ground, clutching his leg. The others spun around, their guns drawn, but there was no sign of their attacker. "Where is he?" Vic shouted, his voice rising in panic. Where the hell is he? Roar's eyes darted across the terrain, his heart pounding in his chest. Stay calm, he barked. He's trying to scare us. Pick us off one by one. Don't let him rattle you. But the fear in his voice was unmistakable. Clint had turned the gang's high ground into a trap, their defensive position now a killing ground. Clint moved silently through the shadows, his rifle slung over his shoulder as he approached the cliffs from the side. He knew they would be watching the open ground, expecting him to come straight at them. But Clint never played by his enemy's rules. He was the ghost in the dark, and tonight, the outlaws would learn that there was no escaping him. The quiet after the gunshot was deafening. The canyon, once filled with the gang's bravado, now carried only the sound of Carter's ragged breathing as he writhed on the ground, clutching his bleeding leg. The wound wasn't fatal, but it was enough to immobilize him and send a ripple of terror through the remaining outlaws. Sanchez crouched behind a rock, his knife trembling in his hand, while Vic's wide eyes darted between the shadows. Roar, however, stood frozen, his revolver gripped tightly, his knuckles white. The hunter was close, too close. The moonlight cast long shadows across the uneven ground, playing tricks on their eyes. Every rock, every bush seemed to shift and move, as if the darkness itself were alive. Clint Eastwood was out there somewhere, watching them, waiting for his moment to strike again. Roar could feel it, a predator's gaze burning into him. He swallowed hard, forcing his voice to steady. He's toying with us, he growled, glaring at Sanchez and Vic. But we're not done yet. Not by a long shot. Not done. Vic hissed, his voice a frantic whisper. Carter's down. Boone's gone. Kane, Briggs. Half the gang is dead, and we haven't even seen his face. He looked around wildly, his hands trembling as he gripped his shotgun. He's not a man, Roar. He's a goddamn ghost. Shut up, Roar snapped, his tone sharp enough to cut through the mounting panic. He's a man just like you and me. He has to reload, has to rest. He's just better at this than we are. But we still have the numbers. We can end this here and now, if you don't lose your nerve. Sanchez tightened his grip on his knife, his dark eyes narrowing. Fine, what's the plan, Roar? Because if we stay here, he's going to pick us off one by one. Roar took a deep breath, forcing himself to think clearly. His mind raced as he surveyed their surroundings. The rocks provided decent cover, but they were pinned down. Clint had them surrounded, using the shadows and terrain to his advantage. They needed to draw him out, force him into the open, where they could confront him directly. We set a trap, Roar said finally, his voice low but resolute. Sanchez, take Carter and move toward the west side. Make some noise, draw him out. Vic and I will stay here, keep him pinned down. When he shows himself, we take him out. Sanchez hesitated, his distrust of Roar evident in his expression. But he knew there was no other option. Nodding reluctantly, he moved to Carter's side, hoisting the injured man onto his shoulder. You better not screw this up, he muttered, his tone bitter. If this goes south, it's on you. As Sanchez and Carter moved westward, Clint watched from his vantage point, concealed behind a cluster of rocks. He could see the gang's desperation, their fraying nerves. He knew Roar was trying to outsmart him, but Clint had faced far more dangerous opponents in his time. These men were amateurs compared to the enemies he had dealt with in war zones. He remained still, his breathing steady, his rifle poised. He had the patience of a predator, and he wasn't about to be lured into a trap. Sanchez and Carter stumbled through the rocky terrain, their movements clumsy in the darkness. Sanchez called out, his voice echoing through the canyon. Come on, you bastard! Show yourself! His words were defiant, but his tone betrayed his fear. Clint smirked, his sharp eyes following their movements. He could see the strain in Sanchez's posture, the way his shoulders tensed with every step. They were bait and they knew it. Back at the makeshift camp, Roar and Vic waited, their weapons ready. Roar's eyes scanned the horizon, searching for any sign of movement. "He's going to come for them," he murmured half to himself. He can't resist an easy target. But even as he spoke, doubt gnawed at him. Clint wasn't like anyone he had ever encountered. He didn't make mistakes, he didn't take unnecessary risks. He was methodical, calculating, and unrelenting. Minutes passed, each one stretching into an eternity. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the faint rustle of wind and the distant cries of frightened passengers still huddled in the train. Then, without warning, a shot rang out. It came from the west, where Sanchez and Carter had gone. Roar and Vic spun toward the sound, their hearts racing. Another shot followed, then silence. "He's picking them off," Vic whispered, his voice trembling. "We're next." Roar gritted his teeth, his anger bubbling to the surface. "Not if we take him first." He stepped out from behind the rocks, his revolver raised. "Eastwood!" he shouted into the darkness, his voice echoing through the canyon. "You hear me? You think you're clever hiding in the shadows? Why don't you come out and face me like a man?" The response came not in words, but in action. A single shot rang out, the bullet striking the rock inches from Roar's head. He stumbled back, his confidence shaken. Clint's voice followed, low and calm, carrying across the still night air. "I don't need to face you, Roar. You came into my territory, you made this your fight, and now you're going to pay for it." Roar's grip on his revolver tightened, his face twisting in rage. "Come on then," he bellowed. "Let's finish this." But Clint didn't answer, he didn't need to. The night belonged to him, and Roar was about to learn just how deadly one man could be. The canyon lay in a tense, suffocating silence, broken only by the faint echo of Clint Eastwood's voice still hanging in the air. Roar stood frozen, his revolver raised, sweat dripping down his brow as his eyes darted frantically through the darkness. Vic crouched low behind a jagged rock, gripping his shotgun so tightly his knuckles were bone white. The earlier bravado of the gang was long gone, replaced with the primal fear of prey cornered by an invisible predator. Sanchez and Carter were silent now, their fates uncertain but heavily implied. Roar didn't need confirmation. He knew they were gone. His gang, once 9 strong, was now reduced to just himself and Vic. The two men, hardened criminals with years of blood on their hands, were now trembling like children, realizing they were up against something they couldn't outthink, outmaneuver, or overpower. "Vic," Roar hissed, his voice low but sharp. "Stay close. He's out there, but he's still just a man. He can't take us both if we work together." Vic didn't respond immediately, his eyes fixed on the shadows, his breathing was shallow, his chest rising and falling in quick bursts. Finally, he managed to whisper, "He's not just a man, Roar. You've seen what he's done. Boone was a sharpshooter and he never stood a chance. Sanchez was faster than any of us, and he's gone too. He's something else." Roar turned to glare at Vic, his face a mask of fury and desperation. "You want to lie down and die, is that it? Fine, but I'm not going down without a fight. I didn't come this far to lose to some wannabe hero with a gun." But even as Roar spoke, he couldn't shake the doubt creeping into his mind. Clint's voice, calm and measured, had rattled him more than he cared to admit. This wasn't a man defending gold. This was a predator dismantling its prey, one piece at a time. From the shadows, Clint watched the two men, his sharp eyes tracking their every move. He could see the cracks in their composure, the way their shoulders tensed, the way their heads whipped around at every sound. Fear had taken root, and Clint intended to exploit it. He adjusted his position, moving silently through the rocky terrain, his steps as quiet as the wind. His rifle was slung over his shoulder now, replaced by his sidearm, a sleek revolver with a worn grip that fit perfectly in his hand. Clint didn't rush. He had time, and he knew the darkness was his ally. The canyon, with its jagged rocks and uneven ground, was a hunting ground he had mastered. Roar and Vic, on the other hand, were stumbling through it blind, their fear blinding them to the inevitability of their fate. Clint allowed himself a small, grim smile. This wasn't just a fight, it was justice. Roar and Vic moved cautiously, their backs to each other as they scanned the area. Every shadow seemed alive, every sound a threat. Roar's nerves were fraying, his grip on his revolver tightening with every passing second. "Show yourself," he shouted into the darkness, his voice echoing through the canyon. "Come on, Eastwood. Face me like a man." The response came swiftly. A single gunshot rang out, the sound sharp and deafening in the stillness. The bullet struck the rock inches from Roar's head, sending shards of stone flying. Roar flinched instinctively, ducking behind the nearest cover. Vic let out a panicked cry, his shotgun shaking in his hands. "He's playing with us?" Vic shouted, his voice cracking. "He's going to kill us." Roar, just like the others. Roar gritted his teeth, his anger boiling over. "Not if I kill him first," he growled. He peered over the edge of the rock, his eyes scanning the shadows. "Come on, Eastwood. You think you're some kind of ghost? You think you're untouchable? Let's finish this." From his vantage point, Clint could see Roar's desperation, the way his bravado had cracked under the weight of fear. He took a deep breath, steadied his aim, and fired again. The bullet struck Vic's shotgun, the force ripping it from his hands. Vic let out a scream, falling to the ground and clutching his trembling hands. "No!" Roar shouted, rushing to Vic's side. He grabbed the man by the collar, shaking him. "Get up! Get your gun and fight! Damn it!" But Vic's eyes were wide with terror, his lips trembling as he muttered incoherently. He was done, broken by the relentless onslaught of Clint's precision and presence. Clint stepped into the moonlight, his figure emerging from the shadows like a specter. His revolver was raised, his gaze cold and unyielding. Roar froze, his breath catching in his throat as he locked eyes with the man who had turned his perfectly planned heist into a nightmare. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. The two men stared each other down, predator and prey caught in the ultimate reckoning. Who are you?" Roar gasped, his voice barely audible. Clint's expression didn't change. He took a step forward, his revolver never wavering. "I'm the one you should have left alone," he said, his voice low and steady. "This train, this gold, it wasn't yours to take, and now you're paying the price." Roar's hand twitched toward his revolver, but Clint was faster. Another shot rang out, and Roar cried out in pain as the gun was ripped from his grasp. He fell to his knees, clutching his injured hand as Clint closed the distance between them. Clint stood over Roar, his shadow stretching across the defeated outlaw. "It's over," Clint said, his voice quiet but firm. "You made your choice, and this is where it's led you." Roar looked up at Clint, his defiance gone, replaced by the hollow realization of his defeat. He slumped to the ground, his breath ragged, as Clint turned away, leaving the canyon silent once more. The reckoning was complete. The first rays of dawn broke over the rugged cliffs of the canyon, painting the jagged rocks in hues of gold and crimson. The aftermath of the night's chaos lay strewn across the barren landscape. Bodies of outlaws who had underestimated their prey, discarded weapons, and the smoldering remains of dynamite scattered near the tracks. The once proud gang that had dared to rob the train was no more. Their leader, Roar, knelt in defeat near the wreckage, his revolver lost, his will shattered. Beside him lay Vic, silent and still, his wide, terror-stricken eyes staring into the sky. Clint Eastwood stood over them, his tall frame silhouetted against the morning light. His revolver hung loosely in his hand, the barrel still warm from the night's work. His expression was as calm as ever, his piercing eyes betraying no hint of satisfaction or remorse. He wasn't a man who took pleasure in killing, but he also didn't flinch from it when it was necessary. The Outlaws had made their choice, and Clint had ensured they paid the price for their greed and violence. Roar looked up at Clint, his face a mask of pain and exhaustion. Who are you?" he rasped, his voice barely audible over the gentle breeze that swept through the canyon. His pride was gone, replaced by a desperate need for answers. He couldn't comprehend how one man had dismantled his entire gang, how someone so quiet, so unassuming, had turned their perfect heist into a waking nightmare. Clint's gaze hardened as he stared down at the defeated outlaw. "I'm just a man who knows how to survive," he said simply, his voice low and steady. He holstered his revolver with deliberate precision, the sound of the metal sliding into place echoing in the stillness. "And you made the mistake of thinking I was an easy target." Roar slumped further, his body sagging under the weight of his injuries and the crushing realization of his failure. He didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. Clint turned away from him, his focus shifting to the train that had stood silent through the long night. The passengers were starting to emerge, their frightened faces peeking out from behind curtains and cracked doors. Mothers clutched their children, and men helped each other to their feet, their expressions a mix of awe and gratitude as they looked toward the lone figure walking back toward the cars. Clint ignored their stares, his steps slow and measured as he approached the train's rear car. He didn't need or want their thanks. He hadn't done this for them, not entirely. He had done it because it needed to be done, because he couldn't stand by and let men like Roar take what wasn't theirs, destroy what others had worked hard to protect. It wasn't about heroics. It was about principle. The train conductor, an older man with a weathered face, stepped forward hesitantly, his cap in hand. "Mister, I don't know what to say," he stammered, his voice filled with genuine gratitude. "You saved us, saved the gold, too. If you hadn't been here..." He stopped, shaking his head as his voice faltered. Clint gave the man a curt nod but said nothing. He wasn't one for speeches, and he didn't need recognition. The job was done. That was all that mattered. As the conductor turned to rally his crew, Clint climbed back into the rear car, his boots thudding softly against the wooden floor. He set his rifle down on the bench where he had been sitting before the ambush, his movements deliberate and calm. Outside, the train's whistle blew, a sharp, shrill sound that echoed through the canyon. Slowly, the train began to move, its wheels grinding against the rails as it resumed its journey. Clint sat by the window, his gaze fixed on the passing landscape. The sun climbed higher into the sky, casting long shadows across the desert. The bodies of the outlaws faded into the distance, left behind as a stark reminder of the cost of greed and the danger of underestimating the wrong man. Clint didn't look back. There was nothing for him there. As the train sped away, whispers began to spread among the passengers. Tales of the mysterious guard who had faced down an entire gang of outlaws in one night. Some called him a hero, while others described him as a ghost, a legend come to life. But Clint didn't care for their stories. He had no interest in fame or glory. All he wanted was peace, though he knew it was a fragile thing, easily shattered by the kind of men he had faced the night before. For Clint Eastwood, the railways offered solitude, a chance to lose himself in the endless landscapes of the American frontier. He had walked away from the chaos of his past, from the wars and the violence, but danger always seemed to find him. And when it did, he met it head-on, not because he wanted to, but because he had to. As the train disappeared into the horizon, the canyon grew quiet once more, the only sound the distant cry of an eagle soaring high above. Clint remained seated, his rifle resting beside him, his eyes unyielding as they stared out at the vast expanse of desert. He was a man of few words, a man who carried the weight of his past with quiet dignity, and though he sought no trouble, he was always prepared for it. The legend of Clint Eastwood would grow with each retelling of the story, but he wouldn't hear those tales. He didn't care to. He was simply a lone sentinel, a guardian who stood between chaos and order. For now, the train carried him to the next station, the next horizon, and perhaps the next challenge, and that was enough for him.